From Chicago's CAN TV, this is Chicago Newsroom.
Well, hi there. Welcome to Chicago Newsroom for what I'm hoping and I really believe will be a fascinating exploration of a pretty tumultuous piece of Chicago history. And we'll begin it on an undocumented day 35 years ago in an unnamed location. We don't know anything about this. It's a relatively unknown congressman who was campaigning for mayor. Can I play a piece of tape?
You have done so much to make this community a tight-knit, wonderful, productive community. You've done so much that I'm going to get family. You've done so much I'm going to give you all I've got, everything I've got. I wouldn't give it to anybody else. I saved it for you because I want you to have it. Every one of you. You know what it is? I'm going to be your mayor for the next 20 years.
Well, Harold Washington did get elected, but he didn't get his 20 years because 30 years from now, right about now as you're watching this, on the day before Thanksgiving in '87, he did die at his desk in City Hall. But he'd already been reelected in 1987, so it's possible he could have been reelected many more times. Who knows? He'd have finished his 20 years in 2003. Maybe he'd have done one more just to break Richard J. Daley's record, so maybe that could have taken him to 2007. Now, there are people who argue that that was the point where Richard M. Daley's power was beginning to wane. So how different would Chicago be if those years were Washington years rather than Daley years? Will Harold Washington's brief period on the fifth floor be considered impactful 10, 20, 50 years in the future? We're going to do this today as we bring in, I think, one of the most distinguished panels we've ever had around our table. I'm honored to have all of these people with us, and we're going to introduce them one at a time. Jacky Grimshaw, been here before. It's so great to have you back. Now, you were IGA, right? You were Intergovernmental Affairs for the mayor. How did this happen? How did you get to know the mayor? How did he select you? What was the deal?
Well, my relationship with Harold Washington started long before the 1983 campaign. He was from the 3rd Ward. I grew up in the 3rd Ward. In fact, I grew up two blocks from Alderman Metcalf's home. And Alderman Metcalf belonged to the same church I did, Corpus Christi Church on 49th and South Parkway. Now it's King Drive. And after the 12:15 Mass, oftentimes some of Ralph Metcalf's friends and associates would show up and go up to the Parkway Ballroom. And those associates included Harold Washington, John Strozier, Sam Patch, etc. And so, there was kind of a tradition going to the Parkway Ballroom after 12:15 Mass to have essentially brunch. So that's where my relationship with him started.
So there was a social connection there.
Yes, when I was still a kid. I can't remember how old I was, but I was a kid, I knew that. Yeah. And so the professional relationship really began when he was running for the Illinois State Senate. There was a committeeman of the 16th Ward that was responsible for making sure there were candidates for various political offices. His name was James Bulldog Taylor. And he had his favorite candidate that he wanted to be in Illinois Senate, and it was not Harold Washington. And so one of my good friends, whose mother got her involved in working with Harold, Janet Rowland, asked me to come and help because I was experienced in putting together precinct organizations and getting the vote out. And so that was going to be essential that happened. So from that election to the 1987 mayoral election, I did the precinct coordination for every one of Harold Washington's campaigns.
And then he appointed you to a rather significant position in his administration.
Yes.
So you were there. You were inside the City Hall, your 5th floor, during most of this time, and that's why it's so great to have you here today. For the first time welcoming to the table, we have Pat O'Connor, Alderman of the 40th Ward. I am so happy to have you here today. We were just talking before we went on the air. We were sitting down the other night and going through the roster, the city council, the aldermen today. And there are only two, you and Ed Burke, who are on the council, seated on the council today, who were there when Harold Washington was elected. 48 people have changed seats.
Yeah, there's been a lot of change over the time that I've been there, and you know, I've been through a number of mayors, and all of them have been a little bit different in the way they approach government. But I've enjoyed working, you know, with, and sometimes in opposition too. But it's been a good run, and Alderman Burke wins. I don't think I'm going to try and beat his longevity.
He came in what, 68 or something, right?
He's in real early.
Yeah. Now you were in the 29, and the 29
Yes.
versus 21. So you were the opposition party to Harold Washington. When you look back on it, how do you feel about that?
Well, here I think if you just look at it as if it was opposition every day, all day, then I think that's kind of not telling the history the way it was. Mm-hmm. First and foremost, the council, while we were divided in terms of ultimate votes, we tended to work together on things that we thought were important. I voted for every one of Harold's budgets. So you can say that I was part of the opposition getting to a budget, but when a budget passed, I voted for those budgets. Now, that's not to say that Harold and his administration didn't work hard to get those votes, and it's not to say that I didn't extract everything I could from them in order to vote for
That's
it.
healthy.
But that's really things that
Yeah.
is really, I think, part of the job of being an alderman. You try and do the things that you need to do or can do to help your ward. And you know, in those days, people like Jacky would come along, and we would talk and try and figure out what we could barter and how we could work things out. But by and large, you know, Harold and I, we didn't see each other as opposite teams. It was a yin and a yang, I think, a lot in the council at the time. The outside world thought it was much worse than it was inside.
That's really part of the reason why I really wanted to have this conversation today, because enough time has gone by that we can kind of look at this and see that there's nuance. It isn't the black and white, well, I shouldn't say black and white, it isn't the A and B that it was portrayed as at the time. So we got a lot to talk about. Now, Cheryl Corley is with us today, once again. We've been here many times before. And Cheryl and I, of course, were co-workers over at WBEZ. Were you City Hall reporter at that time, or you news director? I can't remember.
I was I was probably City Hall reporter first.
Yeah.
Well, obviously
Yeah,
first.
yeah.
And then became news director later on.
And I was program director
Yeah.
at that time. And we covered the Harold Washington. We just covered the heck out of the Harold Washington administration. It was good for us at WBEZ. I mean,
Yeah.
'cause
I
it
have a
was-
little bit of envy, though, because I didn't really come back to Chicago until like late 1984. So I wasn't here
not
for
right.
the initial kind of excitement
Yeah.
and hysteria.
Hysteria,
All of that was going
yeah.
on at that time.
But you were certainly around during the council wars, and then
Yeah.
you know the 1987 election was really something. And,
Yeah. I like to
then, of
say I
course-
covered 3/4 of
Yeah.
his administration.
Right. It's. I got to say that we've been chatting before we started here today, and all of us were around. And we, as I said, Cheryl was maybe a little bit late getting in, but we were all there from 1983 on, and so that means, by definition, that we're a little older than some people. And so, you know, some of us are having a few memory issues, and it's really kind of funny to be, as the last few days, I've just been sitting rereading, you know, like Fire on the Prairie and all this other stuff. And it's amazing how much you can forget about this stuff. So we're going to sit and remind each other about it today. Now, along comes 1986, there's a special election, and Chuy Garcia joins the fray. I mean, you had been with Harold all along, right? But you actually joined the city council in '86.
Absolutely. I came to know Harold Washington when he was a state senator, when on a visit to Springfield, not 8th grade, not high school, but to lobby, convince legislators not to enact anti-immigrant legislation, is where I met Harold Washington. He was a state senator, Don Clark Netsch, Dick Newhouse, also progressive from the South Side, and some lakefront liberals to further give us an idea of what progressive or independent politics could be about. in barrios like on the southwest side, northwest side of Chicago. And in 1984, after Harold had been elected mayor, I ran for ward committeeman, and I won my race at the ripe age of 27 years of age. I was appointed later that year deputy commissioner in the Department of Water, so I joined the administration. And in '86, I had the great fortune of being one of the candidates elected to the city council through court challenges to the ward map that was in place at that time, winning in federal court. The court ruling, you need to draw a new map, you need to hold a special election. And I had the good fortune of being one of the people elected to the council that year that helped give Harold Washington a majority in the city council. It was a fantastic experience. It was finally having an opportunity to govern more normally and to finally enable the mayor to get a grasp on the reins of government in Chicago and make the appointments to boards and commissions and finally have the engine humming along and moving Chicago forward. So it was a great time.
How did the numbers change? We had. I mean, the shorthand is we had 29 and 21. So you were only one change, but didn't Luis Gutierrez come in?
Luis
at that point?
Gutierrez was elected a month after. He went to a runoff in April of 1986.
Was this because of the special election?
This was because of the special
but he
election,
came
which
in
also
I see.
elected, I believe, Jacky, 3 additional African-American representatives to the council. So this, you could say, was the finalization of the demographic changes that had happened in Chicago that were not represented in politics yet, but this was the year where it finally happened and where Chicago, I think, finally came to terms with the demographic changes that had occurred over a couple of decades. And it was a really good time because the government was more diverse than ever. Groups that had not had a voice in City Hall were embraced by Harold Washington, and he began to implement his equity agenda of embracing Chicago. And it came 1 year after Harold Washington, the original father of sanctuary cities in the country, had said, this will be a city that will embrace immigrants, we will protect immigrants, we will provide services to you.
It became a 25, well, if you're talking about numbers, it was 25-25 at that point.
And Harold broke the tie.
With the deciding
So
vote in 26.
the congressman, the former congressman who had tweaked the Voting Rights Act in Washington, where you didn't have to prove intent, but rather effect, wound up being the beneficiary of his own good works in Washington when he cast a tie-breaking vote in favor of himself in the city council. And that he was the 26th vote. So with him, we became 26.
Well, you know, I just got to throw this in. I was recycling some papers the other day. Just, you know, went to the paper recycling place, and there was a stack of old Sun-Times. Somebody had just cleared out a basement or something, and I found this in there. Now, this to me is a historic document because this is the red streak for Wednesday morning after the primary. And the headline is early turnout heavy. They had no idea, you know, even in 1983, television and radio had already surpassed newspapers as far as that. So as far as this paper was concerned, they didn't know. And I found it really interesting to look at Mike Royko over here on page 2, who is talking about, he's doing one of his usual columns and everything, but he basically doesn't mention Harold Washington. And later on, there are other columnists there who are talking about the race, and Harold Washington is just barely mentioned. The whole thing is, will Daley defeat Byrne? That was the big question. What's it going to be, Daley or Byrne?
You know, it was so
what happened?
Well, it was so interesting, Ken, because until it was really decided that Harold Washington had won that primary, the press really did not pay that much attention to him. You know, he was not considered much of a factor, and nobody was really paying attention to this kind of groundswell that had happened really in the Black community and this effort that was going on. So, you know, for the media in the Chicago area, Harold Washington, he was a political guy. He had done this, that, and the other, but he really didn't become a force until the election results were known in that Democratic primary.
It's interesting because, I mean, there was such a a huge effort being made, right, Jack?
Oh, absolutely. So
was it 100,000 people or something registered?
Oh, yeah, well, before Harold, Harold would tell me all the time that he was congressman for life. He knew that the 1st Congressional District would elect him, that he just had to make sure he just stayed true to his principles and the promises he made, and he'd never have to worry. So when all the drafting was going on, who was going to be the black candidate? And they finally settled on Harold. Harold kept saying no. And I would talk to him on a regular basis, and he said, no, I don't want to do that. And then finally he agreed to meet with the folks who were pushing this, and he came up with these demands. And his demands came from his reading, because he was a voracious reader, and also he was a student of politics, which is one of the things that I found interesting in working for him and doing his political campaigns. But he talked to Dutch Morial and some of the other, Richard Hatcher, some of the other black mayors, and found out that the key things that made the difference in their campaigns was, one, maximizing their base, which meant registration of voters. The other thing was support of the black community, the black business folks. And the black business folks in the sense of investing in the campaign, providing the resources that would be needed. And so, he had these, okay, if you do this, then I will consider.
I'll do it. Yeah.
And of course, the folks were intent. So they got the black business folks together. They committed $250,000, I think was the amount of money. The other thing is that he wanted 50,000 new registrants. Well, it ended up being more like 200,000 registrants. And it was a time before we had deputy registrars, right? So we had to arrange with the Board of Elections to go to certain places. There was a lot more involved in getting those registrations then than it is now. But we did it, and I always told him, I said, you were hosted on that petard there, Mr. Congressman.
There's a fabulous little piece of video that I found, the wonders of YouTube, right? This is something that some student shot in a classroom. It was an Afro-American class at the University of Illinois in Champaign. And Harold Washington had gone down there sometime early in 1992. We don't even know the date. But he was talking about what it would take to get him to run. I think 82. He already, I'm sorry, 82, what am I saying, 82, yeah, if only. And this was what he said about voter registration, and I think it's just kind of interesting to hear it right now.
I wouldn't be surprised if we didn't register 175 or 200,000 additional people. That's good in and of itself. It sends out all kinds of signals, but the main signal it sends out is this. In politics, if you can't be it, be a threat. And sometimes you're just as well off. If you can't have it or be it, be a threat. Because politics moves on what we call the availability concept. The best guy doesn't necessarily win, the one who has the fewest arguments against him. The best argument doesn't win, it's the one who has the fewest people fighting him. So if you're not a threat, you're not into anything. Secondly, that kind of registration will change the whole political dialogue. It would be impossible for any candidate for mayor to resort to code phrases and racist terms. They'd have to come up front. The bargaining game would get real tight, because out of fear. Secondly, that kind of registration will guarantee that we could change the makeup of the city council by changing about 10 or 15 aldermen. Not all black, because in certain wards where you have 10, 15, 20% black, 25% black, they couldn't elect a black. But what they could do is elect a independent, positive white who would use as a litmus test the black candidacy of the mayor and might get into office, and then you have your coalition going. So you have those things and others that would be byproducts of a strong campaign. But I honestly think the job can be done.
So there you have it. He was laying it all out to some students down in Champaign like almost a year before.
Some of that was true.
Yeah, some.
So when Jacky says that he wanted to be a congressman for life, when I first joined the council, Roman Paczynski had been in Congress. And he had been in Congress when Harold was there, I believe. And Roman had once said to me that the greatest place in the world to grow old is the Congress of the United States. so he shared that thought with Mayor Washington at the time. But I will tell you that in the primary, because that was my first primary. My first run for alderman was in '83 during the primary. In our ward, the only talk was Byrne or Daley.
Right.
I mean,
Right.
Harold was not even part of the dialogue until after. And then that shifted dramatically.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't so much that it was a shift that people in the neighborhood were going to be for Harold, but you had people that were all of a sudden had been lifelong Democrats who were jumping on a Republican train.
Mm-hmm.
And so our fight really in our neighborhood at the time was how many people are going to abandon a Democratic nominee to go vote for a Republican. So the dynamic was a little bit different for us, but clearly in the primary, in a ward like mine, which was obviously a North Side ward, nobody was aware of the organizing or the work that Harold had been doing in the African American community. I think a lot of people woke up that day that were surprised.
Were you aware of it?
Frankly, no.
Yeah.
I mean, quite honestly, we got into the race because we were supporting Rich Daley, and we were trying to tie down the folks that were going to be working for Jane Byrne by making them fight for their own job. So if they had to run an aldermanic race and fight an aldermanic candidate, they couldn't focus as much on the mayoral race. So we more or less, our deal was to just tie down folks that would otherwise be free to work for Jane Byrne and make them work for themselves, and not be as engaged in the mayoral race. So ours was an adjunct. The plan wasn't for me to be the alderman at the time. It was just to run against the incumbent.
So what happened in your ward when Bernie Epton gets into the race as a Republican and it's Washington against Epton? What happened in your ward?
Our ward committeeman and our alderman went for Epton. And basically, I went for nobody. But I had the ability to say my candidate lost in the primary. I was for Rich Daley. I was with him. Now I'm just focusing on an aldermanic race. And I think that the folks that were working for the incumbent alderman made a significant mistake because they jumped into the mayoral thinking that was also going to sweep them in. And actually, I think what it did is as the race took on a tone and a tenor that was really quite ugly in a lot of ways, people began to look and say, I don't want to be part of that. And so from the standpoint, where could they actually have an impact, it was, okay, vote against the guy that jumped on that wagon. We ended up actually in court trying to get an injunction to prevent the people I was running against from putting out posters that said Harold and I were running as a team.
They were putting out?
Well, that was our allegation. They denied it, but we thought we had some pretty good evidence that showed they did. So we ended up in the Chancery Division courtroom prior to the runoff saying these people need to stop. And the Chancery judge actually made a fairly good judicial decision. He aired the complaint. He allowed people to hear what was happening out there. And then he continued the case till the day or two after the actual election date. But it stopped those posters from proliferating throughout the neighborhood.
Wow. So
Yeah, something I never knew that was happening.
Yeah.
Who'd you support in '87?
In '87, I was not with Harold. Yeah, no. Harold didn't win our ward ever. I mean, and he was gaining support and gaining friends, but he was not ever going to win the ward in those first two elections. I mean, Mayor Washington, the first summer of the height of the 29-21, I invited the mayor out to our ward for a picnic. And we have a family fest that actually continues to this day. We do it at Mather Park. And the mayor came out and we walked around and he was received tremendously. I mean, people were happy to see him. They all wanted their picture with him. But at the same time, when he would run for office, he wasn't winning all their votes. But there was none of the ugliness that had been in the campaign that was present there. And then he invited me to meet him at a festival at a Greek church in our ward. And he said, I'll pick you up on the corner of California and Foster and we'll go together. And I said, I'm not waiting on the corner, right? Pick me up at my.
I'm an alderman.
No, but I'm going to stand on the corner for the mayor of the city of Chicago to come by and pick me up. So I said, come by the house, pick me up at the house, and we'll go over together. Because our committeeman at the time was a Greek guy. It was a Greek church. I wasn't the most welcome guy at that church for that thing, and Harold probably wasn't going to be the most welcome figure as the mayor.
Yeah.
So we thought, well, we'll
gonna
go
be a tough
together.
day.
We'll go together, and we'll weather this storm.
So you had something in common.
Yeah, so we had something in common. But yeah, no, he picked me up and off we went. But you know, he was phenomenal with the crowd. I mean, he was dancing with everybody. He did a couple shots of ouzo, and he took some pictures with some local restaurant owners who made sure that I got their picture with him to their restaurant later on.
So you can put it up on the wall.
Yeah, but it kind of goes to my earlier point. All right, so we were locked in a political battle downtown where everybody's saying 29, 21, and here he's out in my neighborhood interacting with all the people in the neighborhood in a real positive way. And here he and I are going to a Greek festival where neither of us are the most popular people in the world. So it kind of, I think, underlines the fact that while people at one level thought this was a terrible time, at another level, you know, there was a lot of interpersonal things that were occurring, and you know, that we were able to kind of work together on some things that I think were really important.
I think that, you know, folks who are in the inner insight like that might have a different perception. But, you know, for those of us who were observers and who were kind of looking at it on the outside, I would say that's a great story. But, you know, I don't know if that would have happened like in every war, you know, and that reception would have been like that. And we saw that often when Harold Washington traveled. I will say, though, that I agree that the mayor had a great personality, and that he was a kind of people person who was able to, you know, really engage people when he was in situations, and really you would able to see him almost woo people as he went into different places and nursing homes and churches and wherever he went, and you could see people go, oh, well, you know, I kind of like this guy. He's kind of personable.
yeah.
But to his point,
charisma
that was
of
the
Harold
charisma
Washington.
part of
Yeah.
him.
Great retail
Yeah.
politics.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
he knew how to deal with people on the street. He knew how to deal in the classroom. He was a consummate intellectual. He was a charmer. He could charm crowds, even if they went there to heckle him or to boo him. And he'd either neutralize them or get a portion of the crowd to be on it by the time he left. He was just endearing that way, a very powerful personality. To the point we were on earlier, you know, we have to acknowledge that post-election, 83, when he's elected, the city had gone through a severe racial polarization. There was tremendous tension, and it took quite some time for that to subside some. We must not forget that going into his first re-election in 87, it caused leaders of the Democratic Party to go third party against the Democratic nominee. So this is very significant. It gives you a better sense of the opposition and the resistance to accepting that a black man had been elected mayor of the city of Chicago. He's making significant inroads, and the city is beginning to have, I think, second thoughts. The communities that didn't support the historic candidacy of Harold Washington, to recognize that he is, through deeds, showing that he is equitable, that he is responsive, and that he wants to bring a city that has been separate and divided for such a long time together and find common ground. And I think that's the huge achievement in the runoff election, where you see his coalition building efforts over many years, you know, that went beyond the lakefront, went beyond his friends in Uptown, or went beyond some Latino friends on the north and southwest side of the city of Chicago. They sort of come together and they help propel the city forward to being more accepting of the city's diversity and the new minority majority of the city that is essentially African American and brown. But Harold also reaches out to groups that had been largely invisible, that didn't have political clout, like the LGBTQ community, the Arab community, the Muslim community, and he brings them out of the woodwork and creates groupings and commissions in the city to say, we want to know what your concerns are, and we want to begin addressing those concerns.
Just in case you're listening to us on the audio stream or on the podcast, that's Chuy Garcia from the Cook County Board, 7th District, I believe you are,
That's
right?
correct, Southwest Side.
Southwest Side, and
You say that correctly.
Sure, he's got to. If he wants to get reelected, he's got to be able to say that. And Chuy Garcia, of course, was in the city council in those days, and most recently a candidate for mayor against Rahm Emanuel. Some people say he's going to be one again. Well, we don't know that, but that's for the future, right?
Beyond the scope of this show.
It's beyond the scope of this show. Also with us today, Jacky Grimshaw. She was Intergovernmental Affairs Director for Harold Washington and a longtime friend of his, and served in the administration. We've got her with us today. Pat O'Connor, making his first appearance on our show, Alderman of the 40th Ward, and long-standing Alderman of the 40th Ward. He's got longevity, man.
Yeah, I'd like to say staying power, but I think it is longevity.
And also Cheryl Corley, who's been covering this stuff longer than she wants to admit in public, now with NPR as Chicago and Midwest correspondent, and formerly with WBEZ, as was I. And we all were around in this stuff, covering it, and I think we all remember
Living it.
And we all remember that night in the city council, the December 1-2.
Oh my gosh.
Which I guess we'll probably have to skip over some of that because there's so much to talk about. But that was a heck of a night, and boy, I remember you and I being on the air all night long, and oh wow.
Yeah, that was. You know, but before we go into that, Ken, I just wanted to add something to what Chuy said about, Washington being able to coalesce so many groups. He also had to coalesce people in the Black community, because there was a lot of separation there as well. And so he was pretty adept at being able to do that, because you had Black nationalists who supported him and who were very instrumental in getting things happening. You had Black religious leaders and kind of Black politicians as well. So it was the kind of the combination of, a lot of folks like to say, the civil rights movement, the nationalist movement, and regular electoral politics all coming together in this one guy, and who was able to make that happen.
So it's not as homogeneous a coalition as we like to
Exactly.
think, or
Right.
oversimplify it
Right.
to that point.
Right.
And did
Yes.
I ever live that?
Yeah, I'll
when
bet you did.
When you're trying to put together a campaign, when you have those various factions going at each other, and all trying to get, my job was to get them on the same page with Harold Washington. There were challenges. In fact, going into election day, there was, we were doing constant polling to find out what was happening and where we needed to direct resources and so forth. And it turns out that our biggest holdout were older Black women. And so the question is, why? What is going on? And in some ways, it's the same thing we found out about the Mexican American community, is that there was a commitment to the incumbent. So, so certain populations, no matter what, the incumbent, unless there was some real reason to leave the incumbent, that's where they were.
You're talking about 83 then?
83,
Yeah,
I'm
okay.
talking about Jane Byrne,
so Jane
right?
Byrne.
So our Mexican American community, older Black women in the Black community, they were sticking with Jane Byrne. So our job was to figure out how to crack that.
Yeah.
And so the last week, 2 weeks of the campaign, we had some of our older Black women who were supporting Harold, Nancy Jefferson, Addie Wyatt, Margaret Smith, do radio commercials and that talked about why they were supporting Harold. And not to put down Jane, but to do the positive on Harold. And also to be the surrogates, going to the churches and so forth, talking about Harold Washington. And that's how we were able to crack you know, the older black women who were sticking with Jane no matter what, you know, and to bring together that 1/3 of the vote that we really needed in order to be in the runoff. We thought that was going to be the case.
I want to mention that Gary Rivlin wrote this book a long time ago, just after Harold Washington died, I think, Fire on the Prairie, and it's kind of a definitive book about all of that coalition stuff. And I remember my own personal story is that I was doing a daily talk show on WBEZ at that time, and one of our regulars, and I still to this day, I'm not exactly sure why he decided he wanted to be a regular on our show, but it was Lou Palmer. And Lou Palmer was, has been given credit as being probably one of the really original people working for Harold Washington. But he broke with Harold Washington pretty severely and would come on our show and hammer away at Harold Washington. It's like, he talks about he wants to be fairer than fair. And that's not what we elected him for. We didn't elect him to be fair. We elected him to give us what's that kind of thing.
Right.
And somehow or other, Harold Washington had to survive all of that. Not only fighting all the big fights over here, but fighting internal fights with his friends.
Exactly. You know, and sometimes, you know, those internal fights can be more vicious
Oh,
than
yeah.
external fights.
If the quotes in this book are to be believed, yes, it was pretty vicious. Yeah.
Well, it was interesting with the council, because if you were an African American alderman when Harold was the mayor, you were a captive. I mean, you either followed, or he just by mentioning that you might not be with him, people would be by that alderman's office in the hundreds.
Well, that's Jacky's job.
And so,
No, well, see, let me clear up that myth. Let me clear that myth up, because what Pat is saying is correct. It was not Jacky. I remember I had this knockdown with
Well, you were
Marion.
intergovernmental, so I figured
I had this knockdown with Marion Humes, who was not with Harold on the CDBG budget, and Harold mentioned it. And folks showed up at a ward, and she came storming into my office. Why are you organizing against me? I said, Marion, I didn't do a damn thing. Those your constituents are saying they want you to support the mayor.
And wasn't it Hutchinson who they had to came in a wheelchair for the vote?
Right, yes.
not even a wheelchair, it was a gurney.
A gurney.
He was on a hospital gurney, but he needed to show up to make that vote, because if people thought that he was faking it, he'd have been in trouble. Niall Sherman, I remember Niall Sherman, he had something going where he was against something that the mayor wanted, and the mayor mentioned it like on television.
Oh, wow.
And like whatever happened in his ward, about 2 days later, Niles came in and he was the most compliant, easy go, it was an amazing thing.
And they'd give very supportive speeches on the floor just to seal the deal.
No, so intergovernmental, I dealt with elected officials. In my organizing role in the campaign, I dealt with the community. Yeah. But, in terms of those fights, I was not out there organizing the community. I was instead negotiating with the likes of Pat O'Connor about the budget. It's what I was doing as part of intergovernmental affairs.
But you voted for every budget. So.
I did. And here, some wards in those days, if you were seen as being cooperative, it could be the end of your political career.
Right. So you
in
have
a
the
ward
opposite
in a ward like
problem.
mine, I felt very comfortable telling the folks in my neighborhood that I voted for this budget because it takes care of these priorities. But I also I would get 20 model blocks at a time, which at the time was new sidewalks, new parkways, new curbs, and they had to go into low and moderate income census tracts. But all of my Albany Park at the time fit that. So during the years that Harold was the mayor, I got pretty much every eligible block in my ward redone. And we worked at the time. I think it was Sharon Gilliam Gist was up in budget. She helped us, get some money from CDBG to do the Old Main at North Park University.
Oh yeah.
So I guess my point is that the administration at the time was willing to work with you to get your support. And in some communities, that support had to be there because of your race or ethnicity. Mm-hmm. In other communities, it would be there because you were working together and you were providing things that allowed us to go back to our neighborhood and say, this is what we got from the mayor for this budget vote, and I think it's worth it. And obviously it was in those days. But I don't know what his relationship was with everybody else, but frankly, he and I had a pretty decent relationship, which was kind of, it was nice, you know. I mean, he was in my house at one point in time, and we had 2 kids and 2 on the way. And he's sitting in the house, and the dining room had no furniture, and my wife had wine and some cheese snacks. And so Harold looks and he says, "I can't help but notice, Mrs. O'Connor, that you have no furniture in your dining room," because it was all the kids' toys and all the rest of the stuff. And Barbara goes, "Well, you don't pay him enough." and he doesn't miss a beat. He looks down and he goes, "Oh, so this is going to be an expensive piece of cheese." You know, but I mean, it was just, you know, there was a great human side to him, but there's very few people, I think, that had stronger political instincts that I've met over the course of my time in politics, because he sized it up pretty well, pretty quickly.
I thought that we should spend the last third or so of our show talking about the Harold Washington legacy and what it means looking forward. And I know this is kind of a vague, soft kind of thing to talk about, but I mean, I just made a list. Harold Washington introduced the whole thing about giving all of the money, giving equal amounts of money to every alderman, right? That was his thing. Daley carried it on. Rahm Emanuel is kind of carrying it on.
And Sawyer did too.
Sawyer, I'm sorry, so did Sawyer. He signed the Shackman Decree.
Yes.
He created, as far as I remember, this is from my own memory, I think he created the Department of Cultural Affairs, if I'm not mistaken, the first cultural plan. Put a lot of women in charge of city departments. He was the first mayor to speak at a gay rights rally. He introduced
Gay rights bill.
He introduced public hearings for the budgets. Another one of those things that Daley couldn't stop. He had to keep doing it, although Rahm tried to stop it. But what spectacles those were, huh?
All the commissioners,
all the
cabinet
commissioners,
was there, yes.
All the commissioners all in a line, like the Politburo. None of them wanted to be there, but yeah.
Getting roasted by the public.
Getting roasted by the public every time. So, you know.
Department of Environment.
No, that wasn't him.
Yeah.
No, it wasn't. Was it?
Quarter.
Serious.
I worked for the Department of Environment right as it was begun, but that would have been, maybe it was. Maybe he did. Yeah, okay, yeah, you're right. I guess you're right. I didn't even realize that he founded the department I worked at. Anyway.
We'll go back on the quarter.
Really parent involvement in the schools. That was the last
Local
thing.
school
Yeah,
council.
local
school
school really
council.
laid the groundwork
last
for that.
Latino empowerment, another part of that legacy.
Right.
The 80s were the time when the Latino community finally got a chance to win seats there, increase the numbers in Springfield. He campaigned with a woman for a clerk of the city of Chicago, and laid the basis for people like one of our very own to go to Congress. Luis Gutierrez, the first Latino Congress member of Congress from Chicago.
I remember creating that district was...
Yeah, that was a little bit of an artistic arrangement.
Creative,
Yeah.
yes. So those are all part of the legacy. It's a legacy of, I think, racial, ethnic fairness, the city coming to terms with its diversity and seeking to have that diversity represented.
All right,
Well,
sorry,
just
go
one
ahead.
other thing, and Chuy mentioned it, and that was that he formally created all of these committees, that recognize Hispanics, recognize older women, recognize, all of those committee things that he created, some of which are still going.
And I would say too that just because of the change in perception that happened because of his elections, that part of his legacy was also laying the groundwork for other black elected officials who came. Carol Moseley Braun, Jesse Jackson, his presidential campaigns, and Barack Obama also credits him.
Barack Obama says it in his book.
The inspiration.
Yeah. Okay, all right, enough of this.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
What what do we make of Harold Washington now and in the future? If Harold Washington had, let's play this mind game. If Harold Washington had had a more healthy heart and perhaps ate a little better and took better care of himself, he might have been reelected again 4 years later, right?
Yeah, with stress, man. You had to eat that stress away.
So, I mean, it's not inconceivable.
No, may I clear up another bit of myth? Harold Washington, when he was in the legislature, he lived in Woodlawn. I lived in Hyde Park. There was a late opening store that usually I would be running in to buy something for my daughter's lunch the next day. And Harold would be there. Now, how did Harold get from Woodlawn to 53rd and Lake Park? He walked. He walked the community. I can talk to people right now who remember Harold. Oh yeah, I was at such and such a place. And Harold walked up and we sat in the park and we talked. When he became mayor, because of some of the threats from that Alderman O'Connor mentioned, they would not let him walk across the street to Councilors Row. So this very active lifestyle was made sedentary. And in addition to that, he felt that doing the city's business was more important than going to see his cardiologist. He canceled more appointments with the cardiologist than I bet you have canceled in your whole life with your physicians. I mean, men have this thing, I don't know what it is about.
What is it about men?
I don't know, about going to the doctor. But he would have cardiology appointments scheduled, and he would tell Dolores, well, yeah, tell Dr., I think his name was Sinise or Sinai or something like that, tell him that I'll come next week. And he never quite made it.
But didn't you actually have a conversation with him shortly before his death about all this? Did I read that somewhere?
About going to the doctor?
Well, yeah.
Jackie and I were involved in the plotting of winning a majority in the city council, and we would go to his apartment and stay up very late into the wee hours of the morning, figuring out how we could do this with some other individuals who were part of that. And he would always be joking about the bicycle that he had, the stationary bicycle, that he used to hang his coats and clothes on, and he would chuckle about it. We didn't find it as humorous as he did, but yeah, it became evident that he wasn't looking out for his health. He became larger, more obese, and for someone his age, that becomes risky. So yeah, he was just too busy to take care of his health, and we try to jokingly and diplomatically say, you've got to take care of yourself.
But my son exposed him. Sometimes for this, not the late nights, but he had his kitchen cabinet kind of thing that we would meet on Saturdays, and oftentimes my son would go with me, and he would hang out in the den right while we were talking. And that's where it actually was a treadmill, wasn't it? Was it a stationary bike? I can't remember.
I think he had both.
Yeah, and so Christopher came in and one day, and he would always say Harold, and Harold would always say, Mayor. And so they had this thing going. Christopher refused to call him by his title. The same thing with Congressman. And so he came back and he said, Harold, do you ever use this treadmill? Go away, boy. Harold, the last time I was here, it said it was on 6 miles. I came back, and it was on 6 miles. I'm back again, it's on 6 miles. Do you ever use this thing? Get out of here, boy. So that was their personal kind of interaction about making sure that he was exposed for not being.
Not too long before he passed away, when there was a council meeting, and the mayor actually went to go up the stairs between floors, and he stopped on the landing before the next floor, and myself and another alderman, who later went on to become a commissioner over at the county, were up above and observed it. And he says, that guy's he's going to die of a heart attack if he doesn't start losing some weight, because if you look at the pictures when he first ran versus when he actually did pass away, it was a big change in terms of weight. But even at that point in time, while you'd say it was prophetic, it was also somewhat predictable that he just wasn't taking care of himself. And that office tends to do that to anybody. It's tough. Yeah. I mean, you have to have significant discipline to be able to carve out the time for yourself. And I just think that he had expectations of himself trying to be a mayor for the entire city, where he kind of sublimated a lot of his personal life to be out there all the time.
And you got to do those 2 banquets a night kind of social.
Well, he often didn't eat at those. He would pick at food or he'd eat the salad.
Okay, I want to, I've got like 5 minutes left
Okay.
here. Issues like gun crimes and violence, the things that are tearing our city apart today, education, police reform. If Harold Washington had had a longer time, would these issues have been dealt with at an earlier period than they were? I mean, you know what I'm trying to get at? Would we be talking about a different set of, would we have a different set of problems on our plates today than we have?
Well, the one thing I would say to distinguish Harold from the mayors I could see him, both Sawyer, Daley, and Emmanuel, is that Harold really was out there in the streets. You know, so he got his information not from us sitting in City Hall, but from the people on the street. So that a lot of the issues that you're talking about, he would have been aware and figuring out how to deal with it long before they became the headlines in the Tribune and the Sun Times. So this whole thing, like I mentioned, the local school councils and parent involvement in schools. He was one of the things I was organizing for him at the time was a summit for around education, which led to the local school council legislation. But you know, he was trying to make a difference in the Chicago public schools at that point in time. And so the whole thing about violence, why do we have gun violence? A lot of it comes from the poor educational system, the system that has educated particularly blacks and browns, you know, not as well as they should have, so that those children are not getting the kind of resources and have to rely on other ways of just dealing with their daily lives and their families' lives. So I think, you know, with a lot of this dysfunction we have now, he would have been aware and dealing with it before it became critical as we're experiencing now.
Part of his passion and what he wanted to accomplish more during the second term was this concept of linked development, that as downtown develops, the neighborhood should correspondingly develop. I think there would have been a greater emphasis on getting at the concentration of poverty in Chicago, especially on the west and south sides. I think he would have been a much stronger spokesperson on the question of replacing the demolished housing, public housing that occurred in Chicago. And lastly, on the question of crime and the violence that those conditions have bred in Chicago, he was keenly aware of problems in the police department as it relates to police brutality and violations that occurred historically in certain parts of the city. So I think that would have been addressed in a different manner because remember, Harold Washington broke with the regular Democratic organization over the issue of police abuse, police brutality in the black community. So his consciousness of those daily realities of people probably would have led to different strategies being deployed.
Well, here's a very specific question. George Bush, I believe it was his administration that came up with the second, came up with the strategy of what are the Hope grants, whatever they were called, Hope Six.
grants.
Right, which is what basically funded Mayor Daley's demolition of the high-rises.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
If Harold Washington had been mayor, would he have taken that money to tear those high-rises down? Anybody?
Well, you know, one of the last field trips I took with Harold was to Ivy Wells and to Madden Apartments, I think they were called. Madden was a high-rise, Ivy Wells were the low-rises. And when we walked down the stairs, I mean, it was atrocious. And we were shocked because we had never experienced, you know, there were stairs that had no treads on them, that were open, that was hanging by rebar and things of that sort. So he fought with his name was in my head, and I was about to say it, and of course I lost it. The HUD, Bush's HUD guy, Pierce, Samuel Pierce, about funding for public housing, and there was this tension between the city of Chicago and HUD over funding. So I can't say that he would have torn it down, all of them down, but he would have invested in them in terms of rehabbing them and making them livable, because they certainly were not.
I think to the point that Chuy brought up was the fact of getting input, though, from other places. So I do think that, yeah, that he probably would have gone with the Hope 6 money to change public housing in the city. But it's like, what do you do after that with the people who are displaced? Yeah. And that's been a big question here in the city of Chicago. And having people return to areas where they lived before has been a huge issue as well. And I think the fact that he was very instrumental in getting community organizations to be a part of input in his administration, that would have happened, I think, with this housing.
Yeah, well, one thing that he was very against tearing down Cabrini Green. He thought that moving African Americans from that choice position, because exactly what has happened with Cabrini Green is what he feared, and he fought that while he was mayor.
I'm afraid we're just about out of time here. Alderman, you want to take 30 seconds? You got anything you want to add to this?
Well, I think it's difficult to talk about how things would be different when you got a 35-year gap.
Absolutely right.
I think that if you look at some of the things, the link development, which Chuy referred to as a vision of Harold's, the city's doing today. We have link development that takes a fund that creates linkage to the communities. The education that Harold focused on, he came to that over time. When he first got elected mayor, there was a strike, and he was in China and said that's the school board's problem, and the first strike. But over time, he really stepped it up.
Pershing Road for that strike.
Oh yeah. But I'm saying over time, he developed an affinity and actually a responsibility for the board. So I think he was one of the first mayors to basically say, I'm going to be responsible for the education of our children, and that's something that I think has carried through the mayors currently. I mean, I don't know a city that's more invested in the public education than the city of Chicago right now. But I will say this, Chicago is a better city today for having had Harold Washington become the mayor. I don't think that there's any doubt that that's true.
And that's a good place to leave it. And that's where we will leave it. Thank you all so much. I've really enjoyed this conversation. And I'm just really grateful you were all able to spend some time with us to talk about this today. As we say, it's exactly 30 years from the day that Harold Washington died in office. We want to make a special thanks today to a bunch of really fine people who made this whole program here possible. To Media Burn, whose incredible archive of documentary footage has a whole side of Chicago that you might not have seen before, and you can go there, Media Burn, go to their website, it's really interesting. To Bill Stamets, who shot hours and hours of footage. We used a couple of seconds of it here today with a Super 8 film camera, and then very generously allowed us to use some of that footage today on the program. It's his documentary, Chicago Politics, A Theater of Power, that's really interesting to watch because it's a whole different perspective. To David Resnick, the lead producer on this show, to photographer Antonio Dickey and our good friend Tom Clark, both of whom provided us with some of the images we've used today, and of course to our crew, Rob, Carrie, Chris, and Luis for their production and editing work, and to the CanTV engineering and technical people, and mostly of course to our stellar cast of special guests who know all of this stuff because they lived through it. Cheryl Corley, Chuy Garcia, Jacky Grimshaw, Pat O'Connor, thank you all for being here today. We'll see you next week with another, thank you. We'll see you next week with another program. Don't forget you can watch this program or any other by going to this address right here or to chicagonewsroom.org. I'm Ken Davis. Thanks. Bye.